Elderly couple lived in a cliffside shack. Their dog found a room, hidden in the rock for 50 years. For 50 years, the mountain kept its secret buried. It wasn't a miner, or a survey team, or a historian who uncovered it. It was a tired old dog, limping from age, who pressed his nose to the cliff and refused to walk away. People called it instinct. Walter called it fate. But when the truth finally surfaced, everyone understood one thing. Rocco hadn't been trying to save the past, he'd been trying to save the people still living with its lies. The cliffside shack clung to Redmar Ridge the way old memories cling to bone. Weather-scarred, half leaning into the wind, yet stubbornly alive. Walter Grady had patched its roof more times than he could count, and Martha had stitched blankets thick enough to fool winter. They didn't call it home because it was pretty. They called it home because it was the last place that hadn't tried to take something from them. Rocco was already awake when the sun filtered over the ridge. The German shepherd stood at the doorway, ears pitched forward, body still as cut stone. He wasn't a restless dog, never had been. 10 years in search and rescue had carved discipline into him, but that morning something sharpened him in an instant. A growl rose from his chest, deep and certain. Walter froze halfway into his boots. Martha, stirring a pot of oatmeal over the small propane flame, looked up. She'd heard that growl before during a mine collapse deployment years back. It wasn't fear, it was warning. "What is it, boy?" Rocco didn't answer with sound. He moved. A quick, controlled stride straight toward the cliff's edge. His nose cut through the cold air, tracing something invisible. Then he stopped at a jagged outcrop. The wind pushed up from below, carrying a strange scent. Metallic. Sharp. Unnatural. Walter followed, breath misting in the morning chill. At Rocco's paws lay a device the size of a toolbox, lights still blinking. Walter recognized it instantly. A high-grade geologic scanner, the kind mining companies used when they didn't want anyone to know they'd been snooping around. Who leaves something like that out here? Before Martha could answer, the quiet of the ridge shattered. A black SUV crawled up the dirt road, tires spitting rock. Too clean for this place, too confident. The vehicle stopped just yards from the shack, and out stepped a man in a charcoal suit, boots polished enough to catch the sky. Miles Harlan. Walter knew the type instantly. Men who smiled like decisions were already made. Men who saw land not as history or belonging, but as an obstacle between them and a profit margin. "Morning, Mr. and Mrs. Grady. I'm afraid this visit is long overdue." Martha stepped closer to Walter, fingers trembling just enough for him to notice, but her voice stayed calm. "What visit?" Harlan lifted a folder, thick with forms and stamped seals. "The county has approved a new extraction zone. This ridge falls within that project. I'm here to notify you that operations begin soon. You'll need to vacate the structure for safety reasons." Walter laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "This land is federal reserve. You can't just— Your information's outdated, sir. The rights transferred 2 months ago. Legally. The structure you're occupying is within the red zone." He tapped the map with a manicured finger. "And based on what our survey indicates, this whole wall may become unstable during preliminary blasting." Rocco stepped between Harlan and Walter, body rigid, teeth just visible. Not threatening, just stating a boundary. Harlan flinched before he forced a smirk. "Call your dog off, please. I don't respond well to intimidation." "He's not intimidating you," Walter said. "He's evaluating you." Rocco didn't look at the man anymore. His ears darted back toward the stone. The metallic scent thickened for him, carried by a subtle draft pouring from a hairline crack in the cliff wall. He stepped toward it, nose almost touching rock. Then he barked once. Sharp, urgent. Martha turned. Walter followed her gaze. A thin sliver ran down the face of the cliff like a sealed door that had waited too long. Harlan's eyes flicked to it before he quickly looked away, as if he already knew what was there. Walter noticed. "You've been digging here." Harlan straightened his jacket. "Our survey team may have conducted preliminary tests. Nothing unusual. Then why's your equipment lying on my cliff?" Walter asked. Harlan didn't blink. "Because my team doesn't make mistakes like that." The words barely left his mouth before Rocco growled again, this time louder, deeper, almost vibrating against the stone itself. The wind rose suddenly, blowing cold air from within the crack. Not from around it, from inside it, like the cliff was breathing. Martha felt it too. "Walt, that's not normal!" Harlan's confidence faltered, just for a second. Then he forced a businesslike smile. "I'll be back with official paperwork. I expect your full cooperation. For your safety, of course." He turned to leave. Rocco lunged, not to bite, but to block his path. The dog's paws slammed into the dirt in front of Harlan's polished shoes. A perfect canine intercept. A message. Harlan stumbled back, eyes wide. "Get him away from me!" Rocco's gaze didn't leave him, but his body angled toward the cliff as if pointing at the real threat. Walter reached down and touched Rocco's collar, not to restrain him, just to remind him he wasn't alone. Rocco eased, stepping back in controlled retreat. Harlan scrambled into the SUV, slammed the door, and tore down the road. Silence returned. Only the wind spoke. Only the cliff breathed. Martha touched the crack in the stone. It pulsed cold. "Walt, this isn't about mining, is it?" Walter stared at the blinking geologic scanner still lying at the edge. Rocco's growl rumbled again, quieter now, pointed toward the cliffside. "No, Martha," he whispered. "They're not here for the surface." Rocco sniffed the air, ears forward, tail stiff. And then Walter said the words that would change everything that followed. "They're here for what's under it." The ridge never truly slept. Even at night, it breathed in cold drafts that slid through the pines and whispered across the cliff face. Walter had learned to tell the difference between wind, falling shale, and the restless quiet that came before a storm. But the sound he heard the previous night had not been any of those. Metal hitting metal. A single sharp clink, swallowed quickly by the dark. He tried to tell himself it was nothing. Old mining debris shifting in the cold. Maybe a loose tool he'd forgotten outside. But the moment he opened the shack door that morning, he knew Rocco hadn't dismissed it at all. The dog was already pacing along the cliff line, nose pressed close to the stone. His tail stayed straight, his stride locked in the tight, controlled pattern he used when tracking human scent during rescues. Not frantic, not confused. Focused. Walter walked closer. "What do you smell, boy?" Rocco didn't respond. He pressed his chest against the rock and sniffed a perfect vertical line that cut down the face of the cliff like a seam. His claws scraped gently at the dirt, revealing more of the line. It wasn't a natural fault. It was too straight, too perfect, like someone had once sealed something long ago. Martha stepped out with a thermos of coffee in her hand. She watched Rocco for a moment, curiosity tightening her brow. He hasn't behaved like this in years. Walter nodded slowly. It wasn't just the posture. Rocco's breathing changed. Shallow inhales, tight exhales, his scanning mode, the one he used when he scented danger underground. Before Walter could examine the seam more closely, the rumble of an engine crawled up the path again. The same black SUV from the day before. More dust this time, more urgency. Miles Harlan climbed out before the engine fully stopped. He wasn't dressed like yesterday. No polished innocence. Today he wore boots and a heavy jacket, as if pretending to belong in the wilderness would make his agenda seem less predatory. "Morning, Mr. Grady. I brought the documentation we discussed." Walter stepped between him and Martha. We didn't discuss anything. Harlan smiled thinly, the kind of smile that never touched the eyes. He held out a packet of papers. County transfer forms, acquisition records, permits, every page stamped. Martha didn't touch them. This ridge is federal land. Redmar Reserve. You can't just purchase federal property without a hearing or a federal agent present. Harlan chuckled as if she were a child misunderstanding a simple rule. The reserve boundaries were redrawn last year. You must not have kept up with the news. Happens in small towns. Walter stiffened. No one from any agency had come to announce boundary changes. That alone was a red flag. But behind Harlan's forced arrogance, something else flickered. He wasn't just here to move two old people off a ridge. He was afraid they'd found something before his team did. Rocco suddenly barked, short and loud. Harlan jumped. Then he tried to mask it with irritation. "Can you control him?" Walter ignored him. Rocco wasn't barking at the man. He was staring at Harlan's jeep, or more precisely, the underside of the jeep. The dog crouched low, his nostrils flaring. Then Walter saw it. Fresh scrapes of silver metal on the vehicle's steel undercarriage. The same kind of scrapes that happen when someone drags equipment across rocky terrain. Walter stepped forward. "You had people out here last night." Harlan's jaw twitched. He forced a laugh. "We have surveyors. The law allows it. Not at midnight." Harlan's mask cracked for half a breath, then he shoved the papers at Walter. "You need to leave the ridge within 30 days. It's non-negotiable. If you refuse, we'll pursue an eviction order." Rocco growled, not at the threat, but at the wind pushing out from the cliff seam again. The air carried that metallic scent, sharper now. Walter leaned closer to the rock. The seam was wider than yesterday. Barely noticeable, but enough. Something inside that cliff was shifting. Rocco pressed his shoulder against the stone and barked again, loud enough to echo across the ridge. Harlan's face paled. He stepped back as though the cliff itself had spoken. "Enough. I'll return with enforcement. This place isn't safe. For you or anyone." He hurried to the SUV, but before he opened the door, Rocco moved. The shepherd cut in front of him, silent and firm. A wall of fur and muscle and purpose. Harlan froze. Walter called the dog back, but Rocco didn't respond immediately. He stared at Harlan with the kind of intelligence that made people uncomfortable. The kind that said he'd memorized your scent, your fear, and your intentions. Finally, he stepped aside. Harlan slammed the door and sped off, tires spitting gravel. Silence washed back in. The wind brushed the cliff. Rocco returned to the seam, nose deep in the rock, breathing in whatever secret the mountain refused to keep hidden. Martha exhaled shakily. "Walt, something happened here long before we showed up." Walter ran his fingers along the straight cut in the stone. "Someone sealed this shut. Someone with tools. Not nature. Not erosion." He took a step back. Rocco pawed at a small section near the base. The dirt gave way, revealing a faint impression in the rock. Not a crack, a line, a hinge. Walter's breath caught. Martha whispered what he was already thinking. This cliff had a door, and someone tried to bury it. Rocco lowered his head and stared into the seam, as if waiting for it to speak again. Walter felt the mountain breathe cold air against his palm, a long, forgotten exhale. Instinct wasn't wrong, and Rocco had never been wrong, not once in his life. This wasn't mining. This wasn't about land rights. Someone had hidden something inside this cliff 50 years ago, and now the mountain wanted it found. The morning broke colder than it should have for early fall. A sharp wind spilled down the ridge, curling around the shack and sweeping through the pines like a warning. Walter stepped outside with his gloves tucked in his back pocket and a pry bar in hand. Rocco was already ahead of him, nose locked on that narrow seam in the cliff face. Walter crouched and studied the shepherd carefully. The dog wasn't restless or agitated. He was certain. A kind of certainty that made Walter's chest tighten with memories of rescue missions years ago, when Rocco found survivors buried beneath 20 feet of collapsed earth. Every time, he'd planted himself in the exact spot the world didn't want anyone to look. Today was no different. "Show me, boy." Rocco pressed his body against the stone and sniffed the seam from top to bottom. Then he backed up exactly 3 steps, lifted his head, and barked once. It echoed off the ridge. A clean sound. Directive. Walter stepped closer and knocked his fist against the rock. The surface felt solid, cold, unremarkable. But when he shifted slightly to the left and struck again, the sound changed. Hollow. He sucked in a breath. Martha, hearing the difference, came from the shack and stood beside him. Her eyes were sharp, despite the tired lines beneath them. "That's not natural, Walt." "No, it's not." He placed the tip of the pry bar into a small gap near the seam. The wind caught the edge, carrying out another faint metallic scent. Something sealed for decades, disturbed for the first time. Martha held her breath. Even Rocco stood completely still. Walter leaned in and applied pressure. For a moment nothing happened. Then the rock shifted. Just a fraction of an inch, but enough to send a thin crack of dust spilling down. "This is covering something," Walter whispered. "Help me clear it." They worked in slow, careful motions. Martha brushing away debris, Walter levering loose stones, Rocco circling in tight arcs whenever he heard something deeper inside the wall. The surface layer of rock peeled away more easily than Walter expected, too easily for ancient granite. A mixture of cement and dust flaked apart beneath the pry bar. Then a sliver of metal appeared. Walter froze. Martha touched his arm. "Walt, that's a door." They scraped away more of the stone, revealing the outline of a steel panel embedded into the cliffside, hidden behind layers of artificial rockwork. The metal was rusted, pitted, the paint long eaten away. But the edges were unmistakable. Human-made. Rocco sniffed the base of the panel and whined low, nudging Walter's hand. The dog's eyes were locked on a small indentation at knee height, half buried under rock dust. A hinge. Walter's pulse kicked hard. Someone had sealed this door. Someone with intention. Someone with something to hide. Martha stepped back as he cleared the last of the rocks. The metal door stood fully exposed now, about 4 feet high and barely 3 feet wide, as if built for utility, not passage. Walter braced his hand on the edge and pulled. It groaned, but didn't budge. "Try the top," Martha said. He adjusted his grip and heaved downward. Something snapped inside the mechanism. A groan of metal surrendered, and slowly, painfully, the door unsealed itself from 50 years of silence. Cold, stale air rolled out, thick with dust, heavy with time. Rocco was the first to step forward. He lowered his head into the darkness and sniffed. Then he walked inside without hesitation. Walter hesitated only a second before following with his flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, and the room revealed itself in a single breath. Cement walls reinforced with steel, old pipes running overhead. A desk collapsed in one corner, metal shelving rusted into the floor, and on the back wall, under a layer of grime and soot, an emblem, a faded insignia of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, year stamped beneath it. Martha stared, her breath catching. Walt. This wasn't a storage room. This was a field station. Walter traced the emblem with his gloved hand. The Corps didn't build anything without purpose, especially not hidden inside a cliff. Rocco moved toward a toppled metal locker and pawed at the base. A small pile of debris shifted, revealing a weathered leather binder with cracked straps. Walter lifted it carefully. The leather fell apart under his fingers, revealing pages of yellowed paper, sketches, and lined entries written in tight military script. Martha leaned closer under the beam of the flashlight. These are logbooks. Walter flipped through the brittle pages. Lines mentioned seismic readings, unexplained vibrations, references to Operation Glassfall, and a repeating phrase, anomaly zone within the ridge formation. Another page detailed a collapse site nearby. Workers trapped. One survivor evacuated for medical reasons. The final entries became brief, almost frantic. Testing suspended. Evacuation ordered. Structure sealed pending further review. Martha swallowed hard. Walt, this isn't a mining record. This is a classified geological study. The Corps was researching something in this ridge. He kept flipping pages, each word tightening the air. Rocco suddenly stiffened. His ears snapped toward the narrow doorway. He growled, low and sure. Martha froze. Did you hear something? The ridge outside moaned with wind, but underneath it, faint and unmistakable, came the scrape of loose rock. A shifting weight. A footstep. Walter killed the flashlight. Silence pressed in. Rocco moved to the threshold, positioning himself between them and whatever was outside. His hackles rose, his breath steadied. He was ready. Martha whispered, barely audible. Someone else knows about this place. Walter felt it too. The presence, the wrongness. And then a second sound drifted in. Not a footstep. A metallic tap. The same one he'd heard the night before. Inside the hidden room, the logbook trembled slightly in Walter's hands. The ridge carried sound in ways it shouldn't. Through stone, through steel, through secrets. Rocco stared into the darkness outside the door. And Walter understood something he wished he didn't. This room hadn't been found. It had been rediscovered. And whoever sealed it 50 years ago never meant for it to stay hidden forever. The logbook lay open across the wooden table Walter had built from scrap lumber, its yellowed pages catching the dim glow of the lantern. Outside, the wind scraped along the ridge like something pacing the darkness. Rocco lay near the door, head raised, ears tuned to every shift in the night. He wasn't resting. He was listening. Walter slid another page aside. Martha leaned over his shoulder. The handwriting was tight, military precise, but the story threaded through those lines shook both of them. "This report," Martha whispered. "Look at the date, June 14th, 1960. Walter read it aloud, voice low. Rockfall event in Sector Delta. 4 engineers unaccounted for. Tunnel collapse likely triggered by anomaly zone exposure. Emergency extraction attempted. 3 fatalities confirmed." Martha swallowed. "And the survivor?" Walter tapped the name written in darker ink, almost pressed through the page. "Seth Boone. Technician, age 29. Martha sat back, stunned. "Boone, as in Celia Boone." Walter nodded. Celia had mentioned once, in one of her rare, open moments, that her older brother worked for the Corps decades ago. She'd said the ridge held something her brother never talked about, something that ate at him until the day he died. But she'd never said anything about a collapse or lost engineers. Walter kept reading. Seth was pulled from the rubble after 20 hours. Suffering exposure, fractured ribs, and temporary disorientation. Subject requested reassignment off project. Later transferred to Administrative Division pending recovery. Martha ran a hand across her forehead. If he survived this, why didn't anyone mention it in the town records? Because someone scrubbed it. She looked at him sharply. "Walt, are you sure?" He pointed at another line, near the bottom. "Project suspended. Materials sealed on site. Unauthorized disclosure subject to prosecution. This was buried on purpose." Rocco shifted, a soft growl rolling from deep in his throat. Walter glanced toward the doorway. The shepherd wasn't looking at them. He was staring at the dark hallway that led back to the steel door embedded in the cliff. He sniffed twice, low and purposeful. He senses something moving again. Martha whispered. Walter leaned back in his chair. He remembered the faint metallic tapping he'd heard the night before, the one that felt like it travelled through the stone instead of around it. He closed the logbook. We need to talk to Celia. They waited until morning. At sunrise, the ridge glowed red, a cliff of embered stone. Celia Boone walked up the clearing trail with her coat pulled tight, her steps slow but steady. Rocco trotted out to greet her first, tail not wagging, but his stance calm. He trusted her scent. Celia reached out and stroked his head. He remembers me. Walter gestured for her to sit. Celia, we found something. We need to ask you about your brother. Her face changed before she tried to hide it. What exactly did you find? Walter handed her the logbook, opened to Seth's name. Her fingers trembled when she touched the page. She closed her eyes as if bracing for a blow she had waited decades to receive. I knew it, she whispered. I always knew they hid the truth. Tell us. She lowered into the chair as if the weight of memory had finally caught up. My brother never lied. Not once. When he came back from that assignment, he was different. Quick to startle, always listening to the rock. He said the ridge wasn't finished speaking. Said something inside it didn't want to be found. Walter exchanged a glance with Martha. What did he mean? Walter asked. Celia looked toward the cliffside. That the collapse wasn't an accident. That the team had opened something old in the rock. A hollow chamber, he called it. A room that had been sealed long before the core ever touched it. Martha's breath caught. Like the one we just found. Celia nodded. Seth said they heard noises inside it. Not voices, but shifts in the stone. He begged his supervisor to shut the operation down. No one listened. 4 days later, the collapse killed 3 men. Seth was the only one they pulled out. Rocco suddenly stood, muscles tight. His ears snapped towards the ridge. A low rumble travelled under the ground, so faint Walter barely felt it. But Rocco reacted instantly, stepping to the edge of the clearing. Celia stiffened. That sound. Seth used to stop mid-sentence when he heard it. Walter turned to her. What did he say it was? Celia hesitated. She looked both of them in the eyes. He said someone else was digging. Not miners, not the core. He said it sounded like digging from inside the ridge. From the chamber they opened. Martha shook her head. Celia, stone doesn't move like that. Celia looked toward the cliff. It does if something buried starts shifting. Before anyone could respond, Rocco barked once. Short. Urgent. A warning Walter had learned to never ignore. He bolted toward the far side of the clearing, nose dragging close to the soil, tracking something. Walter sprinted after him. The ground dipped into a narrow ravine at the base of the cliff. Rocco stopped there, staring at a section of loosened earth. Freshly disturbed. A trail of displaced stones led further down the slope, like something heavy had been moved. Walter crouched. Human boot tracks, at least 2 sets. Deep tread. Fresh. Martha's voice trembled behind him. They were here last night. Celia's hand covered her mouth. And they're coming closer to whatever Seth found. Walter looked up at the cliff. The seam they'd uncovered was wider again. Only by a fraction, but enough that a thin draft now whistled through, carrying a cold metallic scent. Rocco lowered his head and growled, staring at the seam like it was a living thing. Walter tightened his coat and whispered what they all felt rising inside their chests. This isn't just about secrets. Someone is trying to get back inside that chamber, and they're willing to trigger another collapse to do it. The morning arrived with an unnatural stillness, the kind that made even the wind hesitate. Walter stepped outside to refill the water basin and stopped cold. A convoy of 3 trucks crawled up the ridge road, each one bearing the same corporate logo painted on the doors. Harlan Minerals, survey crew. Rocco appeared in the doorway behind him, his fur bristling from neck to tail. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply watched the trucks with the stillness of an animal who had survived too many collapses to trust approaching machinery. The first truck rolled to a stop as Miles Harlan stepped out. This time he hadn't bothered with the polished shoes or tailored suit. He wore a bright orange survey vest and a helmet tucked under his arm, as if putting on work gear could make him believable. "Morning, Grady. We're beginning geological prep work today. Nothing for you to worry about. Just a few tests." Walter crossed his arms. "You don't need a convoy for tests." Miles smiled with the ease of a practiced liar. "We're dealing with a rare mineral vein, a high-yield deposit. It's projected to run directly under your structure. That makes this a priority site." Martha stepped beside Walter, her jaw tight. "This land isn't yours." "It will be," Miles answered, "and you two will be relocated to safer ground. The state has agreed to assist." Rocco stepped forward just enough for gravel to crunch under his weight. Miles shifted back instinctively. The dog's eyes were locked on him, reading him, measuring him. Before any of them could speak again, another vehicle pulled up. A sheriff's department SUV. Deputy Lane climbed out, hat low, expression unreadable. "Lane," Walter said cautiously. The deputy removed his sunglasses. "I got a call from Harlan Minerals about a potential safety hazard. Given the equipment they're using, this shack isn't up to code for active blasting zones." Martha's voice sharpened. "They're not blasting anything near our home." Lane sighed. "Look, Mom, I don't want trouble. But if the company has permits, the county wants residents off-site during exploratory operations." Walter didn't answer, because Rocco had moved again. The shepherd crept toward the back of the nearest survey truck, nose drawn downward like a magnet. He paused at the tailgate, sniffed once, sniffed again. Then his whole body stiffened. His head whipped toward Walter. A sharp bark burst from him, loud enough to make Lane's hand fly to his holster. That bark wasn't warning. It was alert. Walter moved, fast, pushing past Lane and prying the tailgate open. Inside were crates, marked with red symbols. Not survey equipment, not mineral testing tools, explosives. Martha gasped. Lane's face drained of color. Miles took a step forward, too quickly, too defensive. Those are standard charges for seismic reading. Perfectly safe if handled properly. Walter grabbed one crate and slammed it onto the dirt. The lid snapped open. Inside, neatly packed, were blast caps and military-grade detonation cord. "This isn't seismic gear," Walter said. "This is demolition equipment." Lane looked at Miles. "Is that true?" Miles cleared his throat. "Seismic detonations require—" "Cut the crap!" Lane snapped. Rocco growled again, stepping between Walter and the crates. He sniffed the air and turned his gaze toward the cliffside seam they had uncovered days earlier. His ears flattened. His body trembled with instinct. He knew exactly what those explosives were for. "They're planning to blast the cliff," Walter said quietly. "To get into whatever chamber your brother found, Celia." Celia Boone stood at the shack doorway, breath caught in her throat. No one had seen her walk up the ridge. She'd heard everything. Miles scoffed. "We're accessing the mineral vein, nothing more." Martha shook her head. "The Army Corps sealed that chamber for a reason." Lane turned sharply. "Wait. Chamber." Walter didn't hesitate. "Come with me." They led Lane back through the shack and into the narrow passageway behind it. Rocco trotted ahead, guiding them to the steel door embedded in the rock. Walter ripped away the tarp covering it. Lane's eyes widened. "What the hell is this?" The emblem of the Army Corps of Engineers gleamed faintly under the flashlight. Beneath it, the faded date. Walter pushed open the door. The stale air reached them first, tinged with dust and something ancient. Lane stepped inside slowly, scanning every surface. Martha retrieved the logbook from the shelf and flipped to the map they'd found tucked between the pages. She spread it out across a rusted table. "Here," she said, pointing. "This is the vein they're after. But look at these notations, hazard level codes, structural instability measurements. And this." She tapped the red stamped line at the bottom of the map. "Zone quarantined. Unauthorized excavation prohibited." Lane stared at the notes. His eyes traced the circle marking the collapse site of 1960. The handwritten annotation: "Event triggered by destabilized fault along primary vein." The same vein that ran under Walter and Martha's shack. Lane exhaled slowly. Harlan Minerals knew about this. Walter nodded. "They're trying to blast their way into a collapse zone the Corps deemed too dangerous to reopen." Martha's voice trembled. "And if they hit the fault wrong, they're going to collapse half this ridge." Rocco snarled suddenly, deep and guttural. Lane spun around. The sound wasn't directed at them. It came from outside, down below the ridge. Faint, distant, the unmistakable crush of rock being moved. Digging. Lane ran to the door. Walter followed, heart pounding. Martha grabbed the flashlight. Rocco bolted ahead, cutting through brush with lethal precision. They reached the edge of the slope. And froze. Two men in hard hats were already halfway up the ridge, hauling equipment towards the seam. A third man was crouched at the base, attaching a spool of daisy cord to a drill pack. Miles wasn't waiting for permits. He was starting the blast tonight. Rocco growled so fiercely the men looked up, startled. Lane stepped forward, voice thundering. "Drop the gear, now!" But the men didn't drop anything. They ran. Walter watched them flee down the slope, leaving behind one crate, wires exposed, timer blinking. Not a seismic charge, a directional blast. Walter turned to Lane. "They're not mining." Lane nodded grimly. "They're breaking into the chamber." And Rocco, still growling, watched the blinking charge like he understood the truth before any of them could say it aloud. This wasn't about rare minerals. It was about whatever the Corps buried inside the ridge 50 years ago. Night fell hard on Redmar Ridge, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and made the cliff feel alive. The wind cut sharp through the pines, carrying the faint tang of diesel and something far more dangerous. Walter stepped out onto the clearing, lantern in hand, scanning the slope below. He didn't see the survey crew. But Rocco did. The shepherd's head snapped toward the lower ridge, his ears locked. His body rose from the porch like a drawn bowstring. Walter froze. That silence, the one Rocco held in his chest right before disaster, he knew it well. It was the same silence from the night of the mine collapse 15 years ago, when Rocco had pulled 3 men alive from the rubble. Then the ridge trembled, a low, unnatural rumble. Martha rushed to the doorway. "Walt, something's happening down the slope." Walter didn't answer. Rocco was already sprinting toward the ridge edge, muscles firing like a creature born from stone and instinct. Walter chased him, heart in his throat. Down below, flashlight beams bobbed against the cliffside. 3 men were crouched near the seam, attaching det cord to a line of drilled anchor points. Miles Harlan stood a few feet behind them, his face lit by the glow of a tiny remote detonator. Tonight was the blast. Not a test, not a survey, a breach. Walter yelled, but the wind carried his voice away. Miles pressed the activation sequence. A faint beep echoed across the ridge. Rocco lunged. He barreled down the slope, tearing through brush and scree, a streak of black and tan fury. One of the survey men turned just in time to see the dog leap over him, knocking him flat before he could hit the primer. Walter skidded to a stop halfway down the hill. Rocco whirled, teeth bared, forcing the second man away from the wiring. The detonator slipped from his hand and clattered across the rocks. Miles shouted, furious, "Get the charge lit! Now!" The third man scrambled toward the final cord line. Walter's voice cracked. "Rocco, no!" But the shepherd didn't hesitate. He hit the man square in the chest, knocking him back just as the detonator began to blink faster. Too late. Walter dove behind an outcrop. Heat and light roared out of the cliff. A blast so sharp it split the night open. Shards of stone shot across the slope like bullets. Martha screamed from the clearing. The shockwave hit Walter and threw him sideways. He would have rolled over the edge if Rocco hadn't slammed his body into him, forcing him flat to the ground. Then came silence. Not the peaceful kind. The choking kind. Dust churned through the air. Orange sparks glowed across the broken ridge. And where the seam had once been, the explosion had ripped open a jagged wound in the cliff face. The old passageway was visible now, an ancient corridor of carved stone, braced by rusted beams, hidden for 50 years, sealed by the core, and now pulled open like a grave forced to breathe. Deputy Lane came running up the slope, coughing through the dust. He reached Walter first, helping him to his knees. "You all right?" Walter staggered to his feet. Rocco stood guard in front of him, body bruised but unbowed. Lane turned toward Miles, who was shouting orders, frantic now. This wasn't a controlled blast. It was reckless, illegal, and catastrophic. Miles pointed at the open corridor. "Bring the lights. We're finishing what they couldn't." Lane grabbed his arm. "The hell you are. This is a restricted government structure. You don't have clearance for—" Miles ripped away from him. "My grandfather built that operation. He owned the rights before the Corps stole them. And I'm taking back what we lost." Rocco growled so deep it rumbled the broken ground. Walter stepped toward the exposed corridor. The blast had shattered crates and scattered debris across the slope. Among them lay something half buried under rock dust. A metal case. Old, bent at the corners but intact. Rocco pawed at it, whining softly. Walter knelt and opened the latches. Inside lay an 8mm film reel. Martha, arriving breathless, covered her mouth. "What on earth?" Lane shone his flashlight on the metal lid. A label was etched into the surface. Boone, S. 1960. Celia's breath broke behind them. "That's my brother's name." They carried the reel into the shack, where an old projector sat forgotten in the corner from a yard sale years ago. Walter loaded the film with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The projector flickered to life. Celia stood beside Martha, her fingers cold and locked. Lane kept his eyes on Miles, who now hovered by the doorway, his face drained but defiant. The film opened with static. Then an image steadied. A young man, dirty, clothes torn, face bruised, breathing hard, holding the camera close like a confession. Seth Boone. His voice crackled through the silence. "If you're watching this, then something went wrong. The collapse wasn't an accident. We opened the chamber. We shouldn't have. The readings were unstable. We warned them. But Harlan Minerals demanded we keep drilling. They ignored safety protocol. When the fault shifted, my team never had a chance." Celia gasped. Seth continued. "They paid the Corps to bury the report, to bury the truth. They sealed the chamber and told us never to speak of it. But if they ever come back, if they ever try to reopen what we sealed, stop them. The ridge won't hold another breach." The film ended abruptly as a tremor shook the projector. All eyes turned to the doorway. Deputy Lane stared at Miles, disbelief shifting into something harder. "So your family covered up 3 deaths, and now you're trying to finish the job?" Miles reddened. "That film is ancient, unverified." Rocco stepped forward, hackles raised, standing between Miles and the projector. This time, Lane didn't tell Walter to restrain the dog. Instead, Lane stepped beside Walter. "I'm done helping them," he said quietly. "Whatever they're after in that chamber, we're stopping it tonight." Miles backed away, realizing he'd lost control of more than just a blast zone. He'd lost the ridge. And Rocco, eyes locked on him, made sure he knew it. Outside, the cliff groaned again, the newly exposed passageway breathing cold air that carried the weight of 50 years of buried truth. The chamber was open. And now, everything was about to unravel. By dawn, the ridge felt different. Not safer, not calmer, but awake. The kind of awake that follows a storm when the air still crackles with what almost happened. Deputy Lane stood on the porch with the logbook under one arm and the 8mm reel secured in an evidence bag. Rocco sat at his heel, posture steady, watching Lane the way a soldier watches a comrade preparing for a dangerous shift. Lane exhaled. This is going straight to the Regional Federal Office. Military jurisdiction, historical site violation, unauthorized detonation. They're not sweeping this one under the rug. Walter tightened his coat. "You sure you want to take this fight on?" Lane gave a crooked grin. "I think your dog already volunteered me." Rocco bumped Lane's hand gently with his nose. Lane scratched behind his ear with a quiet respect that hadn't been there the week before. "I owe you, buddy. If you hadn't stopped that blast, this whole ridge might have come down." Celia Boone stepped forward, her eyes damp but steady. "Before you go, Deputy." She held out a small envelope. "This was my brother's. He left it for someone who would finally listen." Lane took it without hesitation. He'd become that person now. The drive down the mountain took him 3 hours. By midday, he was seated in a conference room at the Federal Field Office. The agents watched the reel without blinking. Seth Boone's trembling confession filled the room with a truth too heavy to deny. One agent, gray-haired and stone-faced, finally spoke. This chamber wasn't just a mining zone. It was part of a Cold War geological study. Extremely sensitive. Extremely dangerous. Lane handed him the logbook. "And that ridge has people living above it. Harlan detonated charges within 50 yards of the sealed chamber." The agent nodded grimly. "We'll handle it from here." By the next morning, federal vehicles rolled up the mountain road. Miles Harlan stood outside his rental cabin when they arrived, looking smaller than he ever had on the ridge. He tried to argue, tried to smirk, tried to spin. It didn't work. He was arrested for unlawful detonation, obstruction, tampering with federal property, and reckless endangerment of civilians. The news traveled fast. Martha heard it first over the emergency radio. She didn't smile. Just let out a breath she'd been holding since the day Miles first stepped out of that SUV. Walter was outside repairing a cracked joist beneath the porch when she told him. He paused, wiped his brow, and looked toward the ridge. About time. For the next week, the mountain became a quiet construction zone. Independent geological engineers, federally contracted, surveyed every inch of the cliffside. Drones hummed overhead. Rocco watched each one with the curious suspicion of something that didn't belong in his sky. On the 5th day, the engineers gathered on the slope. Walter and Martha stood nearby with Celia, waiting. The head engineer, a man in a battered canvas jacket, cleared his throat. "We've reviewed the blast site, the chamber, and the structural maps. The rock formation is unstable. Always has been. That vein your dog uncovered was sealed for a reason." Walter nodded. The Corps tried to bury it. "No." The engineer shook his head. "They tried to contain it. Not for profit. For public safety. If mining resumes anywhere near it, the ridge could collapse. The whole side of the mountain is one bad blast away from a fatal slide." Martha's breath caught. "Then it's over. They can't touch it. Not legally. The engineer looked at Rocco and gave a respectful nod. This dog saved more than just you. He might have saved half the valley. Martha bent down to hug Rocco, pressing her forehead against his thick fur. You hear that? They finally see what you've been saying all along. Rocco's tail swayed once, slow and proud. That afternoon, Walter and Martha returned to the chamber entrance. Debris still cluttered the floor, but the corridor stood mostly intact. Sunlight cut thin beams across the dust, illuminating the rusted metal supports and the remnants of old gear scattered around. Walter carried a toolbox. Martha held a folded cloth bundle. We talked about this. She said softly, This room doesn't deserve to stay buried. Not like that. Walter touched the cold steel door frame. It felt older now, heavier with everything they knew. We'll restore it, not to reopen it, but to honor it and the people who were lost here. Celia stepped behind. Them, her voice trembling. My brother never wanted his story to vanish. He just wanted the truth to rest somewhere safe. Rocco padded into the chamber first, nose brushing gently across the floor where Seth's film reel had been found. He paused, as if listening to the echo of a memory he'd never known, but somehow understood. Walter set down his tools. Martha unwrapped the cloth bundle, revealing a framed black and white photo of Seth Boone and the other engineers, smiling in front of the ridge decades before fate tore it open. She placed it on a small ledge carved into the wall. This is for them, she whispered, and for everyone who kept this ridge alive long enough for the truth to surface. Rocco settled beside the ledge, lying down with a quiet dignity, guarding the photo like a sentry over the past. Walter watched him and felt something shift inside his chest, a heaviness finally lifting. Lane arrived at dusk, stepping quietly into the chamber with a new wreath in his hands. Thought you might want this here, he said, for remembrance. Martha took it gently. Thank you, Lane. He nodded toward Rocco. Your dog's the one who earned it. When Lane left, the ridge fell into a rare stillness. No drills, no trucks, no lies carved into the soil, just wind, just stone, just truth. Walter turned off his lantern and stood in the fading light of the chamber. Ready? Martha laced her fingers through his. Yes. Rocco rose, shook the dust from his coat, and led them out of the chamber one careful step at a time. The three of them walked back toward the clearing, leaving the memorial glowing softly in the dying sun. Justice had come, but something deeper had begun to take root. Healing. Spring reached the ridge slowly, like it wasn't sure the mountain had earned its gentler days yet. Snow thinned along the edges of the cliff, dripping into the streams below. Pines unfurled new needles. The wind lost its sharpness, taking on the softer whistle of a place finally allowed to breathe. One season had passed since the chamber was unsealed, since the truth clawed its way out of the dark. And in that time, the old room carved into the cliff had changed. Not physically. The steel door still groaned, the stone walls still carried the cold of the earth. But everything inside felt different. It had become a place people approached quietly, a place they stood before with their hats in their hands. It had become the Seth Boone Memorial Room. Celia was the one who named it. She came up the ridge on a crisp morning with a wooden sign she'd carved herself, her hands shaken by age, but her letters clean, deliberate. She asked Walter to hang it above the steel door. When he did, the echo of the hammer against the rock sounded like a heartbeat that had been waiting 50 years to restart. Inside the room, Celia arranged a few things. Seth's photo, the recovered logbook pages sealed in protective sleeves, a replica of the 8mm reel, and a small plaque describing what really happened in 1960. She wrote every word of it herself. Seth Boone, geological engineer, sole survivor of the ridge collapse, saved 2 men before the second cave-in took the rest, forced into silence by the mining corporation that caused the disaster. He left behind evidence of the truth, hidden until found by those who listened. When she finished reading it aloud for the first time, her voice cracked. But not from grief, from relief. He always wanted people to know he tried. She whispered. Now they do. Martha placed a hand on her shoulder. This room is his voice now, and it's stronger than anything they tried to bury. Outside, Rocco lay stretched across the rock threshold, his body forming a living barrier. He had taken that spot the very first day Celia opened the memorial. No one told him to. He simply walked to the entrance, circled once, then lay down with the settled weight of a guardian reclaiming a post. At first, Walter thought it was coincidence, but after a week, after the way Rocco rose only when someone approached with a heavy step or uncertain energy, after the way he seemed to decide who was allowed to enter, Walter understood. He chose the job, just as dogs do when they know their purpose. The locals noticed. They started calling him the keeper of the door. One elderly man from the nearest town hiked up just to thank him. My father worked with Seth. Never knew what really happened. You protected that truth. Bless you, boy. Rocco didn't move except to flick his tail once, but his eyes softened, and the man wiped away a tear he didn't bother hiding. Some people brought flowers, placing them against the wall where the chamber opened. Others brought small tokens, a miner's helmet, an old compass, dog tags from veterans who had lost friends in collapses of their own. The room began to gather not just history, but lives, grief, gratitude, memory. And through it all, Rocco stayed. Walter and Martha found themselves adjusting their routines around him. They brought water bowls, a blanket for cold mornings. Sometimes Rocco ignored it, choosing the bare rock instead, as if staying close to the stone mattered more than comfort. Martha once sat beside him at dusk, stroking his head gently. You know, she whispered, almost to herself, you're watching the same ridge Seth watched. Maybe that's why you won't leave. Rocco didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the valley below, tail resting still. But Martha felt the truth anyway. A few weeks later, hikers from a neighboring town stopped by. They had heard the story, the revised story, the true one. Rocco rose when they approached. One of them knelt, extending a hand in greeting. The dog leaned forward just enough to sniff, then stepped back and sat again. He accepted them, but only at the threshold. Not inside. They understood. The chamber had boundaries, and Rocco was the line. Celia visited often, never for long. She brought her brother's favorite things. A hand-rolled cigarette he never finished. A smooth river stone he'd carried in his pocket during every field job. A photo of him as a boy, smiling with the kind of innocence that seemed impossible now. She would place them inside, brush a hand across the plaque, and whisper, "It stayed hidden long enough. Rest now." Rocco remained at the door every time, watching her leave, watching the wind carry her steps back down the ridge, watching the room settle again after she disappeared among the pines. The quiet aftermath had its own kind of weight, not heavy like fear, but dense like meaning. The mountain felt full, but peace never arrives without the shadow of what almost destroyed it. Sometimes, at night, Walter could still hear the faint ghost of the blast males set off, echoing through the stone. Sometimes he'd wake thinking he heard the scrape of an old shovel. The ridge remembered everything. Yet every time, without fail, Rocco rose, padded to the door, and lay across the threshold. His breathing slow. Sure, anchored. He wasn't guarding a room, he was guarding a story. By midsummer, the wild flowers had crept across the slope again. The cliffside creek shimmered like a thread of glass. and the memorial room, once sealed in darkness for half a century, had become something quietly sacred. People came less frequently now, but those who did arrived with reverence, and each one found Rocco waiting, not barking, not warning, just watching, just holding the line. By late summer, the ridge felt like a place reborn, not commercialized, not crowded, just known again, in a way it had never been allowed to be known before. The truth had a way of reshaping everything around it, like water carving through stone. And the people of Pine Valley finally understood what had been sleeping beneath their feet for 50 years. The first sign that the story had grown beyond the mountain arrived in the form of a white van with a camera logo on the side. Local news. A young reporter climbed out, nervous but determined, clutching a notepad that flapped in the breeze. She approached Walter as he was fixing a loose step on the porch. "Mr. Ellery," she said, "could we ask you a few questions?" Walter wiped his hands on a cloth. "About Seth? About the chamber?" The reporter's eyes softened. "About all of it, especially your dog." Rocco stood behind Walter, quiet and tall, tail low, but alert. The reporter's cameraman knelt, angling the shot carefully. He whispered, "He's even more impressive in person." Rocco tilted his head slightly, evaluating the stranger with the same steady intelligence that had turned an entire federal case upside down. Walter rested a hand on the dog's back. "Ask what you need." The interview began with the facts. The room, the logbook, the reel, the unlawful detonations. But as the minutes passed, the questions returned again and again to the same point. How did your dog know? Why did he guard that door? Do you think he understood the danger? Do you think he was protecting something bigger than you? Walter didn't try to embellish anything. He didn't need to. Rocco saved our lives, not just from Miles and that blast. He saved a man's truth, a whole chapter of this town. Sometimes dogs see what we refuse to look at. The footage aired that evening and spread quickly. People stopped Walter in town now, shaking his hand. Some asked for directions to the memorial room. Others came just to meet Rocco, though most kept a respectful distance, sensing he wasn't a dog who cared for spectacle. He only cared for purpose. And that purpose started taking on new forms. Within a month, hikers on the ridge began treating Walter and Martha's cabin as a rest stop. Walter posted a small wooden sign facing the trail. Ellery Cliff Station water, warm fire, and a place to catch your breath. It wasn't a business. It wasn't even formal. It was just a place people knew they could knock on the door and be met with kindness. Martha turned the back corner of the cabin into what she called the Ridge Aid Nook, shelves stocked with bandages, antiseptic, blister pads, and enough herbal tea to calm an entire search and rescue team. Word spread that if someone sprained an ankle or scraped themselves raw on shale, Martha Ellery would fix them up and refuse a single dollar for it. "I know what it feels like to need help," she'd say. "So does this mountain." Rocco supervised every visitor with a calm seriousness that made hikers straighten their posture without realizing why. He would circle once, sniff the air, and either settle into his spot near the porch or sit a little closer if someone seemed anxious. Children adored him. Veterans understood him. And those who carried heavy personal burdens found themselves staring into his amber eyes longer than they meant to. One afternoon, a middle-aged man with trembling hands approached. He was out of breath, eyes red. Said he'd driven 3 hours after seeing the news segment. "I don't know why I came," he murmured. "I lost my dog last year. I guess I just needed to see yours." Rocco stepped forward, gently pressing his head against the man's leg. The man broke into tears. Walter said nothing. He didn't need to. Legacy wasn't always about stone chambers and buried truths. Sometimes it was about offering a moment of connection to someone who'd forgotten what steady ground felt like. Deputy Lane started stopping by more often, too. At first under the guise of checking that no trespassers were wandering near the memorial room. But after a few visits, he stopped pretending. He arrived with coffee, sometimes with extra nails for Walter's repairs, sometimes just to sit on the porch and let the quiet talk for him. He and Walter had become something close to family, linked by a night when everything nearly went wrong and was saved by paws on rock. Lane would toss a stick lazily across the yard. Not fetch. Rocco was not a fetch dog, but he'd trot after it, bring it back, halfway, and drop it with a look that said, "I'll humor you, but only once." Lane always laughed. He's the most serious soul I've ever met. Dog or human? Walter nodded. He carries things. That's why. Lane didn't ask what things. Some truths didn't need translation. As summer deepened, the ridge welcomed more hikers, more families, more people simply wanting to feel the place that had become a quiet legend. Some said the mountain felt alive. Some said it felt healed. That the wind no longer sounded like a warning, but like a sigh. Walter and Martha often stood outside at dusk, looking toward the memorial room where Rocco lay like a sentinel carved from the earth itself. The legacy wasn't just Seth Boone's anymore. It wasn't just theirs. It belonged to the ridge, to every person who learned its story. And most of all, to the dog who refused to let the truth stay buried. Rocco lifted his head at twilight, ears forward, as if listening to the mountain breathe. Then he settled again, watching the valley below, guarding the past, guiding the present, holding the line for whatever came next. Autumn settled over the ridge with a quiet, golden heaviness, the kind that makes every sound sharper, every breath a little deeper. The cliffside glowed red in the late afternoon sun, and the wind curled through the pines in long, low sighs. Walter was sitting on the porch steps, sanding the handle of an old walking stick. Martha was inside preparing stew for an evening hiker group, and Rocco lay stretched across the warm boards, one ear raised, the other resting lazily against his head. Age had touched his muzzle with a soft frost, but nothing had dimmed the sharpness in his eyes. A boy climbed the last stretch of trail toward them. 15, maybe 16. Backpack slung unevenly, camera in hand, cheeks red from the climb. He paused, catching his breath. "You must be Mr. Ellery," he said. "My name's Jacob. I'm doing a school project on local history. My teacher said, well, she said I had to talk to you." Walter chuckled softly. Hard to say no when a teacher's behind it. "Come on up." Jacob stepped closer, eyes widening as he saw Rocco. Is that him? The dog from the chamber story? Rocco lifted his head, studying the boy with a slow blink that somehow felt like a greeting. Jacob swallowed, humbled by the quiet presence of a dog who'd become something like a legend. "I was hoping to ask you something," he said carefully. "Something that didn't make it into the news." Walter set the walking stick aside. "Go ahead." Jacob hesitated, glancing from Walter to Rocco. Then it came out all in one breath. Why did Rocco keep digging at that cliff the first day? It was a simple question, but something in the way the boy asked it made the world fall still for a moment. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Walter leaned back, eyes drifting toward the cliff face glowing in the sun, the same cliff where their lives had cracked open and rearranged themselves. He thought for a long time before answering. "Rocco never digs for trouble," he said quietly. "He dug because something under that rock had been buried too long, something the ridge wanted remembered." Jacob frowned gently. "But how would a dog know that?" Walter smiled. Not wide, just enough to show he'd heard that question 100 times since everything happened. Dogs don't think the way we do, Jacob. They don't get lost in the noise we make. They feel what doesn't sit right. They hear what we refuse to hear. They sense the truth long before we're brave enough to look for it. The boy lowered his camera, letting the words settle. Walter continued, his voice slow, steady. Rocco dug that first day because he wasn't chasing danger. He was chasing a story people forgot, one that needed someone to pull it back into the light. Rocco shifted, rolling onto his side so the sun warmed his ribs. His tail tapped the porch once. Just once. As if agreeing. Jacob raised his camera again. Could I get a shot of him? Rocco didn't pose. He didn't sit up or stare dramatically at the horizon. He simply remained exactly as he was, a dog at peace, at home, guarding nothing and everything at once. Jacob snapped the picture. That's perfect, he whispered. Behind them, the memorial chamber caught a spill of sunset. Its steel door glinted faintly, and the plaque with Seth Boone's story glowed like it held fire inside. The wind swept across the ridge, carrying pine scent, old echoes, and something softer, something like closure. Walter stood slowly, joints protesting, and rested a hand on Jacob's shoulder. Make sure your story does him justice, not because he's famous, but because he remembered something the rest of us forgot. Jacob nodded. I will. He started down the trail, leaving Walter and Rocco alone with the falling light. The boys' footsteps faded below the ridge, and the forest settled into its evening hum. Martha stepped onto the porch with 2 steaming cups of tea. For you, she said. And for him. Walter took 1 cup. Rocco sniffed the other, then placed his head gently on Martha's knee. She laughed softly. I know, you're off duty, but you still watch everything. Rocco's ear twitched. The sky shifted to amber, then to gold, then to the cool blue of a mountain evening. The ridge glowed like an ember refusing to go out. Walter looked at Rocco again, his voice almost a whisper. He digs for the truth people forget. The camera panned out across the red cliff, where the wind whispered through the stone that once held silence for 50 long years. Now it held something different. Legacy, healing, memory that would not be buried again. And then, as the scene widened, the narrator's voice rose gently. If you've ever had a loyal dog, if you've ever felt a truth stirring before you understood it, if you've ever been saved by something with 4 legs and a beating heart, then you know stories like this don't end. They live on. Just like Rocco. What's your story with a loyal pet? Share it with us. And if this journey touched you, consider subscribing to German Shepherd, where every dog's courage deserves to be remembered.